Hello again, everybody. Welcome to Oakwood Cemetery. What we're doing today is a continuation of the last episode. You may have seen it. That was our greatest romances. It takes a little longer to tell these stories. Most of our romances involve more than one person, as you might imagine, and that means more biographies, more information, and so they take a while to tell. We can get fewer in an episode, and we'll do another 4 or 5, I guess, today. If you remember the last time we were here, we gave you a little quiz, see if anybody could identify the heart here. We didn't have time to do the Bower of Lies story, but we will today. It's probably Oakwood's best known story. That is, if you know any stories at Oakwood, probably this one is one you would know. It involves one Rachel Blythe. Rachel was Cherokee blood. In fact, her father was a Confederate soldier in Thomas's Legion, for those of you who are Civil War military inclined. And her mother was a full Cherokee. Mom died. Various circumstances meant that Jackson Blythe, her father, Rachel's father, couldn't take care of her, and she wound up actually in 2 of North Carolina's orphanages, the first Oxford orphanage and then the newer Thomasville orphanage, and in each one she was taught secretarial skills and did quite well at it. Came to Raleigh, took clerical jobs, largely as a stenographer. In fact, I believe she taught it for a while at a little business college downtown. She was the stenographer, secretary, clerk, if you will, for the North Carolina Teachers Association. So she did well at what she did. And while she was here, she stayed at a boarding house at the southeast corner of Capitol Square. Branson's boarding house it was. Now also there was a man named Adolphus Gustavus Bower, a man from the West Virginia, Ohio area who had been a draftsman for a famous architect in the Northeast named Samuel Sloan. When Sloan came south to survey, apparently, what would become the governor's mansion in the 1880s, he died of sunstroke here in Carolina. And it was Bower who took over some of the jobs that Sloan would have supervised had he lived. That included the governor's mansion. So if you visit the governor's mansion, you'll see a plaque on the front gate that misnames Bower. Despite our advice to the docents there, they persist in calling him G.A. Bower when it should be Adolphus Gustavus Bower. But at any rate, he's largely responsible for the mansion as well as other buildings that Sloan would have designed, such as Memorial Hall and Chapel Hill. So a very important architect in our history. He met Rachel apparently through Branson's boarding house in downtown Raleigh. They both stayed there, fell in love, and however, it was a problem for them because that was inappropriate. She, after all, was an Indian, he was a white man. In fact, it was illegal in those days for the two to marry. It turns out that Levi Branson, who ran their boarding house on the side, was a preacher, and he married them, which I think satisfied their own sense of right, but it defied the law in effect. Her problem, she began to show a pregnancy, and that was embarrassing because the people in Raleigh didn't realize they were married. It was a secret one. So they went off to Washington, D.C., got married, came back, and lived together, had a little house on Wilmington Street. Some people rejected them, and other people accepted them just fine. It varies. It seems to have been a mix of both. But at any rate, they carried on. She delivered 2 children for her husband, for A.G., Owena, a girl, and Fred, a boy. And it was soon after Fred's birth that she passed away. Described as some sort of internal inflammation. I'm not sure they knew then or know now exactly what it was that took Rachel's life. But she died, and it left A.G. in a difficult position. He himself had been injured in the head in an accident, a train accident, a train that hit his carriage, given him a head injury, and he suffered from that. He lost his wife. He had 2 children to take care of and a business to maintain. A tough time for him. The children went off to family. Fred went back to the tribes in the mountains, Owena up to relatives in Ohio. He stayed on in Raleigh, and one of the things he certainly accomplished was to design this marker for Rachel, which is so familiar to many of you. He designed it. Legend says he built it, but no, he designed it. And the Cooper brothers, who've done a lot of work out here, including the gate that you came through to get to this tour today, the Cooper brothers built it, and this, of course, designed it in Rachel's honor. The temple is he ordered this. It's represents the temple to Diana, a Roman goddess of chastity. And people have interpreted that as a satisfaction of his own guilt, if you will. He felt he'd gotten her in deep trouble by her pregnancy when people didn't know they were married. He wanted to confirm that he viewed her as a very chaste and pure girl. You see that in some of the other symbols. You see the heart over on this side. You see an anchor, hope, look to the future. In back, the empty bed, if you will, well kept now by one of our docents, Madonna Phillips. Anyway, a very attractive a monument. You see her photo there. It's been cleaned up, but is off for repairs now. Again, some damage over the years. And the words that he left here, true worth is being, not seeming, I think was a reminder to the people of North Carolina who just recently adopted a state motto, esse quam videre, to be rather than to seem. I think he's challenging the people of North Carolina to respect their own state motto in their feelings for Rachel and himself. Now, there was nothing in this to him. When his landlord went up a year or so after Rachel's death, found him dead of suicide. He'd taken his own life with a pistol. He left a note that said he wanted to be among the people of Raleigh, who in effect he implied had treated him well. No resentment there, but no memorial to him. In fact, it wasn't until 1980s that this monument went up to him after a fundraiser held at the governor's mansion that he had helped to design and build. And finally, several groups got together and they gave a monument to AG, along with the note that Robbins just showed you the words from the note that he left behind at his suicide. I've always thought one of the sad ironies of his death, which was in May of 1898, was reported in the newspapers, I believe it was May 4th, the very day that the death of Ensign Worth Bagley in the Spanish-American War was announced, and it was Bagley's story that took over the whole newspaper, just about, certainly the front page and so forth. It was all Spanish-American War news, and this story, which would have been on the front page, so well known was the relationship, wound up on page 4. So, sort of a sad footnote, if you will, to what is one of Raleigh's, surely one of Raleigh's most famous romances. All right, Robin and I have moved to the Mordecai section now, one of the advantages of doing a virtual tour. This spot will, I guess, be in a way a threefer. So this is a romantic corner, it turns out, of the Mordecai section. And one of the stones I've always paid attention to is this one here. It's to Catherine Miller, Kate Miller. Why have I paid attention? Because there are a number of Catherine and Kate Millers in my family. This one is not related. In fact, this is a Catherine Devereaux Miller, if you can read it, which is very hard to do. And if you're from Raleigh, you know the name Devereaux, and that puts her among the sort of the plantation elites, if you will. Very well-landed family, before the war anyway. And this stone is interesting for another reason too. It's the only stone that we're aware of that lists by name both of her husbands. Now, sometimes you see on a male stone, particularly one where the man has married two sisters, you'll see them both listed. We may not have another example where husbands are listed by name. And that tells me either she was very forceful in life or her second husband was a very generous man. Don't know which. She married twice. The first one she married during the war in 1863, and here's his tombstone, George Baker. And during the war in North Carolina, things were tough. It's a tough time, even for a wealthy family, and that's reflected in the descriptions of her wedding, which is quite well described by a famous diarist who was a member of her family. The food was scarce. They couldn't get, for instance, sweet raisins, so they used sour cherries, and her undergarments were hand-me-downs. Her wedding dress was bedclothes, remade into a gown. So you see, things were tough at the time. A happy wedding, but a sort of a tragic story. George died not too many years later in 1872 down in Fayetteville, and got what is really a very handsome stone. You see, it's been cleaned up nicely, and we're going to come back to it in just a few minutes. But anyway, that leaves Catherine, a widow, and she remarries a second time to one Thomas Monroe Argo. Now, Argo, a big name in North Carolina legal history. He studied law at UNC after the war under William Horn Battle, whom you met several of our tours ago, a giant in the legal education in North Carolina. Argo, a founder of the North Carolina Bar Association in the 1880s, he took the big cases, including cases that made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Big name. He had been married twice. His earlier wives had passed away. He'd had several children, but when you read their story, you sense that Catherine was really the love of his life. They were older now, about the same age, mature. This was not a quick romance. This was a serious matter, if you will. In fact, he was building a house which he would dedicate to her, a large house, just a couple of blocks north of where we are now. And they were going to live there for the rest of their lives. That was the plan anyway. However, Kate also passes away in 1886. He stops immediately the work on that house and just leaves a shell. Nothing but some of the walls remained. And the people in Raleigh, I think somewhat cruelly, especially if he heard it, referred to the house as Argo's Folly, which would have been a sad reminder to him of a lost love. Anyway, he stopped work on the house, bought a big house in Oakwood, where he spent the rest of his life, as far as I can recall. And a certain irony, the house, the shell, was eventually bought by a man named Norris, who was also an attorney, who had often been on the other side in these courtroom disputes, and he turned that house, what was to have been Thomas's and Catherine's house, into a giant house, which is still standing there off of Lafayette Street. And my apologies to the owners of the house now if they wind up with cars in their driveway, but it is a lovely house here in Raleigh. Now let's go back to Baker's monument, and what I'd like Robin to do, if she can, is to pan down to the signatures on it, the people who carved the stone. That was John Caton and William Oliver Wolf, W-O-L-F. Now, we've become very interested in the people who carved the stones here, but Wolf in particular, he's been called the best known stonecutter in the history of North Carolina. Why? Well, in great part because he was the father of Thomas Wolfe, W-O-L-F-E. And we'll talk about that in just a moment too. But anyway, W.O. Wolfe came to Raleigh in 1870, lived here to 1880, married twice, and his first marriage is the one we'll address today. Now, neither of the participants in this romance are in Oakwood. However, they have evidence. We have evidence of both. You've seen some for W.O. Wolfe. His first wife, a young girl called the prettiest girl in town, was Hattie Watson. You've met her father, John W. Watson, called the father of North Carolina photography. He worked out of, he lived in Oakwood. She was an Oakwood girl. W.O. Wolfe lived in the Oakwood neighborhood. They married, and it was just a dreadful marriage. Now, to appreciate part of the problem that Hattie faced, W.O. Wolfe was some 6'4". His son describes his eyes as cold and uneasy, and he was a drinker, a spree drinker. And when he drank heavily, he became very violent. And it didn't matter, it happened to be his wife who was the object of violence, but in this case it certainly was Hattie, and the descriptions from her divorce papers that she filed in the 1870s are horrific. How he would put her up against the wall, how he would literally whip her with a whip, called her terrible names, and at one point had her on the floor, his foot on her neck, and a pistol pointed to her head. Somehow she thought this was grounds for divorce. And, one of her attorneys who represented her in her divorce hearing, you've already met too, that was Dan Fowle, who 15 years or so later would become governor of North Carolina, live in the governor's mansion. Anyway, Hattie and W.O. Wolfe got their divorce. One of the interesting aspects of that hearing, one of the ironies, each accused the other of being infertile, that they would never be able to have children. In fact, you see that obelisk over there where Robin is panning now. That's E. Burke Haywood, a well-known physician, testified on Hattie's behalf that W.O. Wolfe would never have children, which is very ironic because one of the children he had was author Thomas Wolfe, and I think 6 or so others. She too, Hattie wound up having several children, as far as we know. She is not buried in Oakwood, but her parents are. What else did I want to mention to you? Ah, yes, the E. This is WOLF. When he came to Raleigh, it didn't have an E. It does now. If you have a volume by Thomas Wolfe, like Look Homeward Angel, or You Can't Go Home Again, and you see the E at the end of the name, his father added it when he was here in Raleigh. In fact, we like to call it, are you ready? The Raleigh. So, we hope, seriously, we hope that we've added a bit to the scholarship on the Wolfe family by suggesting that that addition happened in the fall of 1872. And we do that by comparing tombstones, some with an E, some without an E, some with an E, and anyway, there, you can tuck that away in your literary basket. Okay, once again, we've made a leap across the cemetery from the Mordecai section to, this is the Christ Church section. And this story involves the Haywood family, particularly Marshall Delancey Haywood and what became his wife. Marshall Haywood, again, a member of a family who was tremendously important to the history of this city as well as the history of this state, the Haywood family. The Haywood House, built in 1854, still downtown, still stands downtown. That was Marshall's residence. Now, Marshall Haywood became a renowned historian. I mean, it's just remarkable what his career included. He was for a long time the librarian of the North Carolina Supreme Court, and he was the official historian for a number of institutions, if you will, including the U.S. War Department, the U.S. Navy Department, the Sons of the American Revolution, and the North Carolina Episcopal Church. So this was a busy man, loved history. In fact, you get the idea that he would love to have his nose in the book, sort of like Thomas Argo, who scorned the frivolity of society. Marshall Haywood sort of scorned the frivolity of his brothers, who used to play the banjo and drink out on the front porch of the Haywood house. Not Marshall, he was a teetotaler all his life. Now, the other principle in this story is compared to Marshall anyway, and that's part of the point of the story, a young girl You see both their names on this stone. She was Martha or Mattie Hawkins Bailey, and she was a Florida girl who, because of the problems in her family during and after the Civil War, had come to Raleigh to live with with relatives, if you will, the A.B. Hawkins family. And the Hawkins lived in what's now the Lieutenant Governor's office building there on Blunt Street, several blocks away from the Haywood House. Marshall got to know young Martha, or Mattie as she was called, who was almost 20 years younger than he, but over time they got to know each other better and fell in love. The gap between them initially was simply too wide for them to pursue that. In fact, during a walk around the Capitol one day, when she was 20 years old, Marshall asked Mattie if she would marry him. And she said, "There's just too much time between us." And he said, "I'll wait and see if you change your mind." And she did. 17 years later, she accepted his proposal and they were married. And they lived in the Haywood House, had a child. She had a child, I believe she was 40 when she had Marshall Delancey Haywood Jr., to the surprise of the city. But shortly thereafter, Marshall didn't live too long after that. He passed away. Mattie lived long after he, and he died during the Depression. The family fell on hard times, and she turned the first floor of that Haywood House into an antique shop called Crabapple, and sold antiques out of it. It's been suggested that she was on the plump side, and it was suggested that part of it might have been because every time Marshall would write her a letter, he'd send it with a box of Whitman's chocolates. So a happy, prudish, described as prudish, but very happy young lady with a good sense of humor and a wonderful romance. We're in the Tucker section now on Chapel Circle. This story is, if you've been on our tours, you have remembered this one. In fact, I usually ask for volunteers to do this one, but since you seem a shy lot, I won't call for volunteers today. But we actually act out some of this. There are three principals in this story. No, this is the G story. They have a different relationship. But that does revolve around this person. This is Lewis D. Henry, the D. debonair. I will introduce you to the three principals. First of all, Lewis Henry was from New Jersey. He was a Princeton graduate, and he came south to New Bern to study law under a relative, I think he was an uncle or something, who had worked for John Jay, a famous Supreme Court justice. So coming south to study law in New Bern was not a strange thing. The female in this story is named Lucy Hawkins, an important name in 19th century North Carolina. In fact, Lucy's brother, William, was just finishing up his third term as governor of the state. Now, in those days, the governorships were much shorter than they are today, but nevertheless, she was important, her family important politically. The third person here was a man named Thomas Stanley, another Princeton graduate, another one studying law, and this is important and a little unbelievable, a good friend of Lewis Henry. Now, the three of them wound up at a party held at the home of William Gaston, a famous judge, if you will, in North Carolina. And the three of them were sitting at the same table. This was the acting out part that we do with you otherwise shy volunteers. And Lucy was sitting next to Lewis, who they apparently had come together to the event or had met there, but they were a thing, an item. Thomas Stanley was across the table, and he, young man that he was, wanted to attract the attention of this attractive young 18-year-old at the time. and he had a little tea cake in front of him. He began to break it up and flip pieces of it across the table. Well, a piece of his cake landed in Lewis Henry's teacup, splattering his vest. And Lucy, the story goes, turned to him and said, "Do you take that?" Well, Lewis apparently took that as a challenge. And he challenged Thomas Stanley to a duel, which they carried out in 1813 near Suffolk, Virginia, and Lewis Henry killed Thomas Stanley. He fled, not knowing if he was going to be prosecuted, stayed away for a time, but then came back to North Carolina. He married Lucy Hawkins. He became an assemblyman. In fact, he became the Speaker of the North Carolina House, and in 1842 ran for governor and was defeated by someone whose name many of you will know, Governor Moorhead. So Lewis Henry, an important person in this, he and Lucy were childless. She died, and she's not buried in Oakwood. She's buried in City Cemetery, and I have a feeling that's where Lewis initially was. He died in 1846, long before Oakwood was founded, so I have a feeling he was moved over here. He remarried a woman named Margaret Haywood, and they had 7 children, one of whom is right next door. That's Malvina, with a rather interesting stone, if you will. Lewis, what were the consequences of the duel for him, besides some bad publicity, which didn't seem to hurt him? Number 1, he lost a finger, shot off in the engagement. And number 2, the story is, he never slept a night after that in the dark. He always had to have a light on when he slept because he was afraid that either the ghost of Thomas Stanley was going to come and get him or his family. An odd romance. All right, we moved around Chapel Circle a bit from our last talk, and we are in the Johnson section now. To appreciate this story, you need to understand the atmosphere in North Carolina in which it occurs. A great deal of passion, a great deal of drama. Without that, I think one just can't really appreciate what's going on. Anyway, some dates. April 9th, 1865, Appomattox, General Lee surrenders. April 13th, 1865, William Tecumseh Sherman and the Federal Army capture Raleigh. The next day, April 14th in the evening, Abe Lincoln is shot. The next day, the 15th of April, Lincoln dies. That Monday, April 17th, 1865, Chapel Hill, near Raleigh, surrenders. And the general who goes out to take that surrender is named Smith Dykins Atkins. He goes out and he meets with some Chapel Hillians, including David Swain, the president of the University of North Carolina. At least one battle, I think it's Kemp Plummer Battle, is out there with him, also representative of the town and the university. Several people go out and meet Smith Atkins. They officially surrender. All this has been arranged in advance, but the official takes place on the 17th. The Union Army, several hundred strong at this component, occupies Chapel Hill, and they stay there for a long time. That's important to appreciate too. Now, during the occupation of Chapel Hill, Smith Atkins, General Atkins, pays a call on the president of UNC, David Swain, goes to his house. And some would say this is a courtesy call. Others say he went to arrest David Swain. I think the latter is unrealistic. But at any rate, they sit down and have this wonderful talk. They both have a great interest in history, military history, particularly the American Revolution. And Swain has things that he wants to show his visitor, General Atkins. So he calls to his daughter, Eleanor, or Ella, she went by, please bring me X book. I think he wanted a map of Cornwallis's trek across North Carolina during the Revolution, among other things. So Ella walks in the room to hand it to her father, where he and the general are talking, and they have what I call a laughs event. Love at first sight. And this is surprising. Why? Because you would have to look hard in Chapel Hill in these days to find someone more sympathetic to the Southern cause than Ella Swain. She was, oh my goodness, despised Yankees. In fact, she had told her father that if General Atkins came to the house and sat down and had dinner, she wouldn't be at the table. But she changed when she came face to face, when their eyes made contact, the story goes anyway. And for the next several weeks and months, if you will, General Atkins courted Ella. For one thing, he had the regimental band serenade the house. He wrote her a long poem that full of symbolism, indicating his affection for Ella. This became a serious romance. By that summer, they were engaged, married in August. A controversial marriage. Many people in Chapel Hill resented what was going on, given the circumstances of the day. In fact, during the wedding, which apparently took place in Swain's home, they had invited some friends to come, several of whom spat on the invitation, I guess sent it back. And the students at Chapel Hill made themselves famous, if you will, for ringing the university bell for 3 hours during the ceremony to try and distract and undermine what was going on. Tensions remained so high, given the atmospherics of the day, very unpopular. I think it was so unpopular that the general, she called him the general, G-E-N-L, General and Ella went immediately to his home in Freeport, Illinois. It wasn't going to be a comfortable place raising a family in Chapel Hill at the time. And they lived in Freeport. He became postmaster and a newspaper man up there, had children there, but she often came back to Chapel Hill to visit her family. Her father died soon thereafter, but her mother continued in Raleigh. So she would come back, and on one of those visits, in 1881, I believe, she came back, and we were having one of our usual influenza, not a pandemic, but a epidemic, if you will. She got sick, and she died here. And we'll visit Ella here. She's not buried in Freeport. In fact, she's not buried with her husband. She's buried here. But when Smith Atkins continued in Illinois as a newspaper man, highly respected, when he died, he's buried there. He's buried in Freeport, but it's not as though he ignored Ella, because his tombstone has their story. Who he married, when they were married, where, that sort of thing is recognized in Freeport. Here, I think the only recognition down at the bottom, hard to read, the kindliest heart that ever beat. Very hard to read. One footnote to this, Ella's mother. When Smith Atkins first came to the Swain household to eat, she refused to sit at the table with him. That would honor him too much. Ella did, but the mother wouldn't. And in fact, when the family moved to Freeport and Ella's mother, Mrs. Swain, would go up to visit them there, she wouldn't eat with them up there. She would eat in another room, and General Atkins would carry her food in and sit and talk with her. That was different than sitting at the table, which in effect would have given official recognition to what had happened. I believe even after Ella passed away and her mom would visit the family, she refused to sit at the table with her son-in-law. That atmosphere, when Ella and Smith Atkins met, lingered on, at least in the minds of some people, for a long time.